The theme of Design Week is folklore or storytelling, the future. And it's apt, as tonight we celebrate stories of making, particularly those anonymous craft, trade and design skills that give us buildings, the streets, the buses, much that shapes our lives. Now, the skills and tolerance of the people I met while working in the jewellery trade and friends I made has prompted this event. It was a real education. I now work here in the Design Tower, previously Hammond Lane Foundry, which we're going to hear lots more about, where goods like cookers and the street lights with the shamrock by the light bulb were made, many of which we can still see on our streets. So I'm delighted Ciarán is going to cover this recent industrial design and production history, and Billy will lead into it with an account of very significant art and craft associations in Dublin. And as Mary has mentioned, finally, but most important, we would like to hear your stories of time spent working, including in all the local industry, because unfortunately so much learning and skills and history is lost, and only the past can help us create our future. So, Billy, thanks.
That's great. Hello, and you're all very welcome to this talk on the art and crafts. On the art and crafts movement in Dublin in the early 20th century. And I want to thank Mary and Breda for the opportunity to present my paper here this evening. My main area of research, as Mary mentioned, is on the Cool Press, one of these arts and crafts enterprises. And the logo there is what came to define it really. But I'll get to the Cool Press later. First, I want to look at the origins of the arts and crafts movement. My viewpoint from all of this, I'm coming from a history, but an art history perspective, so just be aware of that. But the first thing I want to do is I want to look at the origins of the arts and crafts movement in Dublin, in Ireland and Dublin, and to show that it was a coherent and well-structured scheme. It didn't just happen, but it resulted in the emergence of an internationally renowned crafts sector in the first half of the last century. So I'm then going to look at 6 early Dublin city-based studios and a couple of related craft workers from among the many. And I might, at the end of that time, I might mention the ones that I've omitted just in the list. The term arts and crafts was first coined in 1888 in London at a meeting of artists keen to enhance the status of the minor arts, which they believed were unjustly overshadowed by the fine arts of painting and sculpture. By the minor arts, they meant printing, stained glass, needlework, art metalwork, jewellery, pottery, and so on. It was also a reaction against mid-Victorian manufacturing or mass-produced inferior products that ultimately developed into a campaign for improved craftsmanship, better artistic design, and improved workers' conditions. William Morris had set a practical example of this when he founded a firm in London in 1861, which was organised in the manner of a medieval guild, with members collaborating in a range of crafts. And some of those you can see here on the screen. That's Morris himself, so furniture, and then the textiles covered furniture, tapestry down the left, stained glass, but there were others as well, such as printing and all of that. Morris was a respected figure, and his firm met the minor arts respectable and paved the way for other like-minded groups to emerge, culminating in the founding of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1888 in England. This English example was to influence the movement in Ireland as well as elsewhere in Europe and in the US. And so in histories of arts and crafts, you always see William Morris referred to as the founding father. At the same time, in Ireland, a number of philanthropists were involved in setting up what were termed cottage industries for lace making, embroidery, wood carving, metalwork, providing people mainly in poor rural areas with a source of income. Lady Aberdeen was the most prominent of the many women organisers, and her Irish Industries Association sent craft items for sale in Ireland, England, and most notably to the Irish Industrial Village at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Another wealthy philanthropist at the same time was Lord Mayo. He had an interest in Irish art and cultural affairs, and he met with and discussed with William Morris how an arts and crafts society could be established in Ireland, something which would bring together professional artists and crafts workers as well as those cottage groups. The result was the Arts and Crafts Society of Ireland, founded by Lord Mayo in 1894, with the first of several exhibitions being held by it in Dublin the following year. And here are some covers of catalogues from the Arts and Crafts exhibition. Now, there are other exhibitions, but the principal were the arts and crafts ones, and this is from 1910, 1917, 1921. The first catalogue cover is designed by someone called Oswald Reeves, who I'm going to mention again in a minute. The middle catalogue cover is fantastic and is by Harry Clark, and the cover nearest me is by Billy Geddes. So the first exhibition was in 1895, but that exhibition wasn't great really, and they borrowed a lot of work from abroad. It hadn't developed, and it really took nearly 10 years. But it came to meaningful fruition by the 1904 exhibition. The important arts journal, The Studio, reported that the Arts and Crafts Society of Ireland may be congratulated on having helped materially to bring about a renaissance of Irish art industries. That 1904 exhibition saw the first appearance of two new studios, Dunemer Guild and a new stained glass studio called An Túr Glenna, along with quality work from the craft class students from the Dublin School of Art. The School of Art bought into the movement, and they recruited teachers, the best could get, and they promoted teaching in a range of crafts. They recruited leading experts such as Alfred Child to teach stained glass. He was also Harry Clark's first teacher. Also from England hired Oswald Reeves, who designed the first catalogue cover that you see on that screen. And he was an outstanding enamel and metalwork teacher. And there were others as well that he recruited. And by this 1910 exhibition, the director of the National Museum reported that there has been a revolution in Irish craft. Also at this time, Irish craft work was exhibited across Europe, and one English newspaper reported on how good Irish craft was, reporting, "The Isle of Saints may again, as in far-off days, glory in a national art." So it can be fairly said that during the 1910s and 20s, Ireland developed an international reputation for the quality of its arts and crafts products. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 6 more or less city-based arts and crafts studios from the period. So I mentioned 2 early studios from the 1904 exhibition, and they're the first two there on Túr Glenna and Dunemer. So I'll look at those first. On Túr Glenna, or the Tara Glass, stained glass studio, attempted for in the early 1900s. It was located at 24 Pembroke Street in Dublin. It was set up by Sarah Purser in 1903, so this is in Pembroke Street location. Purser was born in Dún Laoghaire and was well known as a portrait painter, and most notably, in 1923, she was the first woman elected to the Royal Hibernian Academy. She managed An Túr Glenna until her retirement in 1940, and it was kept going then by Catherine O'Brien into the 1960s, and then individual artists used it after that, but it really, I see it surviving into the 1960s. That School of Art appointed stained glass artists from England, Alfred Child, as well as teaching. He was employed by Purser as a part-time manager in the glass studio. Child recruited his best students for Túr Glenna, although their most prolific artist, Michael Healy, joined as an apprentice and worked there all his life. This is an example of Healy's work from the Church of the Sacred Heart, Donnybrook in Dublin in 1914. And the design nearest me is in the National Gallery. That's the design for stained glass. And it's the baptism of Evelyn and Fidelma by St. Patrick, with St. Patrick lighting the Paschal candle above. This is another small window created by Billy Geddes when she worked at the studio, and it's now in the Hugh Lane Gallery. The studio received mainly church commissions from all over Ireland and the world. As the manager Child said, An Túr Glenna windows could be seen from Vancouver and Boston to Singapore and New Zealand. So the next studio, and also at that 1904 exhibition, was Dunemer. Dunemer Guild was founded in Dundrum by Evelyn Gleeson in 1902. She was a weaver of rugs and tapestries, and Gleeson studied in London under Alexander Miller, a textile designer and follower of William Morris. She was assisted in setting up the studio by Elizabeth and Lily Yates, 2 sisters of the poet W.B. and Jack Yates. The studio and house, initially in Dundrum, was aptly named Dunemer, meaning Emer's Fort, after Emer, the wife of Cuchulainn, who was famed for her needlework skills. Gleeson, of the trio, Gleeson was in charge of tapestry and hand-tucking carpets and rugs. Lily Yates oversaw embroidery, and her sister Lily ran the printing press. Lily had previously worked with William Morris in London, and Elizabeth received advice and support from Morris's printers in establishing the press. Dunemer soon had orders for work from both home and abroad, ranging from one and we see some here, of 24 embroidered banners for the new cathedral at Lochbray in 1903, to an order from New Zealand for carpets in 1904. William Butler Yeats acted as editor of the press, and Elizabeth issued high-quality, handmade, letterpress books by many writers of the Irish Revival, including William Butler himself. Tapestries and carpets were usually in an Irish style, decorated with Celtic ornamental patterns and motifs derived from sources such as the Book of Kells, while their church banners, like we saw, depicted Irish saints and were usually titled in Gaelic script. Now, relations between the three partners, Gleeson and the two Yeats sisters, were poor, and in 1908 the Yeats sisters broke away and set up on their own under the name of Coola Industries. Evelyn Gleeson remained at Dunemer and concentrated on weaving and carpet making, supported by her niece Catherine McCormick. About 1911, Dunemer Studios moved to the city centre at Hardwick Street, that's facing Temple Street Hospital, and stayed there for most of his existence, over 50 years. Dunemer went from success to success in the following years, including having been awarded a prestigious commission for several carpets for the Dole Chambers in Leinster House. These were designed by Catherine McCormick, who by this stage had taken over from Evelyn Gleeson. Dunemer survived until the mid-60s. Its last home was on Harcourt Street. This was a very prestigious commission they got in the early 1930s for a present from this Irish state to the Pope. It's called the Pope's Carpet, and it is displayed in Clears before the ship abroad. Okay, so that leads me on to the Coola Industries. Which were run by the Yeats sisters, and they were formed in 1908, but really they were a continuation from their time in Dunemer. So after the split from Dunemer, the Yeats sisters established Coola Industries in 1908, as we see here, in Churchtown. They left Churchtown in 1923 and settled in the city then in Baggot Street. And this is a picture from their Baggot Street location. And as Mary mentioned, Trinity College hold quite a bit of the Coola business, archive, prints and books. But when they left, it was a clean split. So this is the last, the item on furthest for me is the last item published when they were at Dunemer. And you'll see just underneath the date, you see Dunemer Press. And this item here is the first item printed at Coola, and you see just underneath the date, you see Coola Press. So literally that was a change. And so when the split from Coola just like to continue, but just in a different location. Numerous artists, including their brother Jack, was commissioned for designs for print, and these were hand-coloured. So that's Jack Yates on the left, Eileen Peake is the artist in the middle, on the top right is Eileen Grieg, and Hilda Roberts on the bottom. We'll see some more good prints later. Others were commissioned for books. So the book, the furthest for me, is the first book that was printed in 1903 under Dunemer imprint. That's by William Butler Yeats. The last book printed is this one, Nearest Me, in 1946 by Elizabeth Rivers. And as I said, they printed the main writers of the Irish Revival. So we have Synge and Lady Gregory there in the middle. You know, they published over 80 books. So these are hand-produced, letterpressed and all of that. Lily Yeats continued the embroidery business. As I mentioned, she worked with William Morris in London. I like this slide. The first cushion, this is designed by William Morris. And the first cushion was designed and made in Morris and Company while Lily Yeats worked there. Now, I'm not sure if she made it, but very possibly did. The second version was made in Dunemer in 1905, and absolutely by Lily Yeats. And the one nearest me was made by Coola in around 1930, absolutely again by Lily Yeats. But it's a nice thread through from the English movement in Morris through to the Irish Arts and Crafts movement. Some more embroideries. That's the Abbey Theatre, designed by Dorothy Blackham and made by Lily Yeats. And the one nearest me is designed by her sister Elizabeth Yeats and executed by Lily Yeats. It's apple trees, also known as spring. And this is a domestic piece embroidered cot cover, probably made by the assistants under Lily's supervision. And you can see Coola Industries is what it says on the side and back side of it. Here's some more prints. The far one is a good print by Beatrice Albury, Beatrice Trinity, but she also worked it on Tuirglenna, and she made a stained glass piece of the same design. The print nearest me is a Cuda print by Hilda Roberts, and I would like to see the original drawings for this, which her daughter has, and she showed me a window that she made, that's a piece of stained glass in her kitchen window, and there it's just wonderful. It's designed and made by Hilda Roberts while she worked in the Clark studios. So those three studios in Tuirglenna, Dooneymer and Cruel are fairly well known. So now, just for sort of balance, I'm going to look at three sort of lesser known ones in the city. Columbus Studios were founded by Joseph Tierney on 14 Westmoreland Street around 1914. He produced calligraphy, mural decorations, illuminations and stained glass. He was joined in the studio at various times on an ad hoc basis by Kathleen Quigley, another wood engraver, illuminator and stained glass artist, and bookbinder Eleanor Kelly. Now, Tierney left Ireland for the US around 1923, so the bulk of his career was in the US, where he had a prolific stained glass career from his New York studio. Quickly immigrated to South Africa in 1934, where she also worked in stained glass. About 100 of her windows from that time have been traced. Eleanor Kelly stayed in Dublin and worked both as an independent bookbinder, but also on occasion with Dooneymer. So I'm just going to look quickly through some examples of her work. In Dublin, they focused on illumination and mural painting. This is an illumination for an ancient order of Hibernia certificate, but it's poster size, so it was designed to be framed and hung on the wall. So it was then lithographed. It was designed by Joseph Tierney. You see his name, and you see Westmoreland Street, and you can see sort of the Irish imagery and sort of neo-Celtic design in it. This is sort of thing that we've done. This is a calligraphy, calligraphy sort of stuff. It's like 12 pages in the book. It was designed for Mrs. Helen Fowle, who had raised money for the Irish prisoners of war and Belgian refugees in 1916. And this was presented to her for her good deed. And you can see it's signed by Joseph Tierney. The bookbinding is also signed, and it's signed because Eleanor Kelly and bookbinders in general always had their sort of unique tools that they use at this time. So there's motifs on that. The cross motif was unique to Eleanor Kelly, so in the way she signed that. These are two further bindings by Eleanor Kelly. Jitanjali, the far one, and we can see the same motifs are this sort of cross here. You can see quite a number of them in the far side. It's in a private collection for Kenny. And the one nearest me is a missive. It's a much bigger format than the far one. It's a missive in the Homeland Chapel in Cork. She did a number of bindings for the Homeland Chapel in Cork. As I said, Tierney went on, had a fantastic career in the United States. Like, the scale of his production is huge. This is one window he did in Los Angeles Seminary in 1940. I just put it in because it's St. Patrick and has the 4 provinces, but I'm not going to dwell on that. And actually, this seminary, I'm going to mention it again in a minute in Los Angeles. This is the Columbus Studios, the Craftworker Studios in 1919. These were established in Harker Street, and established by William McBride and a few others. And it survived in the Second World War. I'm not sure the exact date, so I think it in 1942. This advertising flyer describes their work and mentions some of its members. We can see the focus on ecclesiastical commissions. And that's because the church were really good patrons. It advertises mosaics, frescoes, altars, and its members included Jack Morrow and the well-known sculptor Albert Power. So in this brochure from the National Gallery, again, they're talking about, it's focused on the church. And this railing nearest me was made for a bank in Waterford. It was designed by the craftworkers, but it was made here in Pearse Street, and I'll come back to that in a minute. These are some of the other things they did: stained glass, all the furniture, and murals and fresco designs. This is a window they made, and they exhibited at the 1939 New York World's Fair, and it was bought at the World's Fair and then installed in the same Los Angeles Seminary that 10 years later Joseph Tierney let him work for. Now, at this time, this building, 39 Harker Street, it was a hub of arts and crafts in the city centre. And apart from the craft workers, it housed other studios, including the Cluna studio, which is the last studio I'll talk about in a minute, and the Three Candles Press, and craftspeople such as Frank Brandt, who designed himself as a graphic designer, pressman, and he did posters, and there are others I've listed here. The Frank Brandt, I love that poster, it's 1929. It's fantastic to think there was an international Grand Prix in 1929. But look, it evokes speed and glamour and modernism, the exact opposite to Dour Ireland, that we were often told exists in 1929. Nice. That brings me to the last studio, the Cluna Studios. It was established by Gertrude Grew and Margaret Daisy O'Keefe in 1922. A couple of years later, in 1924, the Cluna Studios opened the Dublin Art Shop at 54 Dawson Street. Some people might remember it. As an outlet for their products and those of other craft workers and studios, including books and prints from Coola. So they opened the art shop. They were still in Harker Street, but then they moved their studio to Harker Street, to the Dawson Street premises as well. This ad here appeared in the 1925 Arts and Crafts exhibition catalogue. So within the crafts listed, Cluna focused on prints, painted woodwork and jewellery. So we can see some examples of the prints here. So this print nearest me of St. Stephen's Green, that was the largest print they produced, and it was by Margaret O'Keefe. This is my favourite print they produced, and it's designed by Catherine O'Brien, and she was the person who took over the running of On Tour Glennock, and Sarah Purser retired. She ran the St. Last studio for many years. So you see there's lots of little connections between all of the various groups. So this is some other work here. So painted woodwork in the middle, and sorry the photographs isn't great, but often had this neo-Celtic design on it, and then are these Irish figures, and that was a really popular line for them. The piece nearest me is an enamel plaque made by Margaret O'Keefe, one of the founders of the studio, and it was a very successful piece for her, and it won numerous prizes at exhibitions. She also made versions of that, other versions of that, as pendants and as jewellery to be worn. This piece is in an American private collection, and the jewellery is in a UK collection. So this is the art shop here on the left. So you can see the retail premises on the ground floor, and just above it, in those rooms, that's where Cluna operated from. But in the studios above that, there were other independent craft workers that they rented space and then sold their product as well. And sorry, this is just her took part in a fair in the Mansion House in I think about 1938. So two of the craft workers who rented space were Doreen Dickey and Nan Holland. So I'm just really quickly on those. Both were students of Oswald Reeves in metalworking and enamelling while at the Dublin Art School in the 1920s. Dickey worked on a range of crafts, including enamelled metalwork, example here of a candlestick. Nan Holland was principally a jeweller in the arts and crafts style, and these are examples of her work. The Dawson Street premises closed in 1962, and the Dublin Art Shop moved into 110 St. Stephen's Green, closing for good in the early 1970s. These worked in arts and crafts studio, but sometimes the industrial craft trades intersected with the arts and crafts studios, and that is exampled by a firm that operated on Pearse Street for nearly a century. J&G McLaughlin were established in 1875 by John and Charles McLaughlin, and they built a substantial business in church and industrial metalwork of all types, including roofing. We see an example on the left, an industrial premises in Swords. But it included its spires, railings, gates, altar rails, brass, candlestick holders, Ensign burners and tabernacles. Now, if we look at the ad, it's interesting. We see that they identify themselves as art metal craftsmen. They work with metal, but the addition of craftsman and art in particular elevates their process and products, and it was well deserved. If we look at this page from an advertisement brochure, we see wonderful items. Lamps that they made, but note here they include the architect's name. Either the architect commissioned them or they commissioned the design. And it would be wonderful to see some of these lamps back around the city. We see more of their work here. We see one of the gates for Minster House and the Banshee House that they made. And that iron railings that I showed you that the craft workers designed for the bank in Waterford earlier is also made by J&C McLaughlin. And on this side, nearest me, we see where the casting for artists. So we see Oisin Kelly and Gabriel Hayes for two artists that the cast works for. McLaughlin's also, and we know this from the archives, for Margaret Heath, who's in the Cluna Studios, and Dorian Dickey, one of the crafts people. They made copper and brass elements for both of them, probably for use in their enamel plaques and making candlesticks and things like that. This is one item we can firmly attribute to McLaughlin's, and it was probably made by the founder's nephew, Alfred McLaughlin, who incidentally lived with the Pearce family. The McLaughlin and Pearce family were related through marriage and had close personal ties, like John McLaughlin was best man at Howard Pearce's parents' wedding and that. The item here is a freedom box of Sir Charles Cameron, and it's made in 1910. It was in a private collection, that's where I got the photograph, but the College of Surgeons now own it. Cameron was an eminent physician, and he worked to eradicate diseases within Dublin, and he was also involved with the corporation in the sewage system and improving that as well. So he made him a free man of Dublin, so hence he would get a scroll saying you're a free man of Dublin, and I think when you two got it to graze their sheep in St. Stephen's Green, I don't think Cameron ever did that. So the scroll then would be held within this box, and one of the glass knobs, carbutions on it, you press that and there was an elaborate opening mechanism for it. And you see here that we can see the presentation script on the far side, but here we can see it's designed by Cranwell Wilson, who was the city engineer stroke architect at that stage. And you can see that the marble was Hugh Madigan supplied the marble, but it was made and assembled by J&C McLaughlin, and as I said, most likely Alfred McLaughlin. Now, so I brought the arts and crafts back to Pearse Street, but before I finish, okay, I'm very conscious, there's so many studios and so many workers. I'm just going to have about 5 slides here with 5 other people that I want to mention that I think should feature in any such presentation like this. So some of these are that type. So obviously Harry Clark and the Clark Studios in North Frederick Street, sort of fantastic. Harry Clark himself in 1931, and then the studios kept going through the 1970s in North Frederick Street. The cabinet here was made by James Hicks, who was a wonderful furniture maker on Pembroke Street, could equally as well be included in this job. There are loads of students of Oswald Reeves in enamelling and metalwork. One of my favourite is this piece by Dora Allen, who eventually married Reeves as well, his wife as well as a student. And that's my favourite enamel piece by any of the students. Maya Cranwell, who is a wonderful jeweller, probably best known for making the Senate casket, which held a scroll with the names of the first senators. That's in the Royal Irish Academy. These are some of her jewellery. Kathleen Cox, there was surprisingly little pottery made in that period, but Kathleen Cox, who had a studio in Schoolhouse Lane off Molesworth Street, she really was a special talent. And these are just a sample of her works. I just put this one in here. The Royal Irish School of Art Needlework was one of the few groups that existed that exhibited at the very first Arts and Crafts exhibition that was held in 1895, and these were on Clare Street. So all of these groups existed within the city. Okay. So I'll leave it there. Okay.
Hello everybody. It's great to see this place full. It does my heart good. It's wonderful. And thanks very much to Breda and to Holly and to Mary for putting it together. And thanks for to all of you for coming out. I need to check just very quickly if John Berrigan is in the room or not. He's not. Okay, I can say what I want about him. So the reason I ask is John gave an interview to a brilliant public history student of mine called Helen King 2 years ago, alongside Anne French and Dolores Wilson, talking about Hammond Lane Foundry and what it was like to work in the 60s in this place. For most people who are alive around this area, most people refer to this site as the old IDA rather than Trinity East or whatever it is we're calling it this week in Trinity. But before that, it was known as Hammond Lane and the Foundry. That was what was here. So I'm going to base most of what I have to say around Hammond Lane Foundry. But I'm also going to talk about the area itself and how it developed over time into what it is today. And I'm also, at the end, going to play you 2 short clips from that interview that John Berrigan gave us. The reason it's significant is John Berrigan was the last apprentice who ever worked in Hammond Lane Foundry. He came in 1963, finished in 1973, and what he has to say is really interesting. I'll come back to those at the end. So what I always begin with is, I suppose, a more general idea. And the general idea I want to begin with is that the Docklands is arguably the most engineered, developed landscape in Ireland. Right? The environment itself is man-made. So not only is the landscape itself dredged out of the sea gradually over generations, everything that's happened here really has been produced by people. And that's a kind of interesting way of beginning to think about the work that came out of the area as well. So it's defined by its relationship to the dock, the sea, the heavy industry of the area, because I don't need to tell the group that's here, it's a place of work, first and foremost. And so what I always say is that when we think about this exact area, which we now call the Docklands, really what it was, you know, for almost a millennia, it was a landing place on the Irish coast for all tourists, conquerors, settlers. Home to the Viking Longstone, marks the landing place of Dublin's founders. It was here, the port, the sea, that sort of dragged the city back out towards Ringsend and filled it with transport and communications technology. And that's sort of true right down to the present, actually, if you think about the industry that's in here now. More on that in a moment. You know, so it's defined, really, by a sort of global trade and a global connection. It's a globalized space of industry. Why does it matter to Hammond Lane? Why does it matter to where we're sitting? To some extent, I think one of the ways that the history of this place is told is often as if Google and Facebook and all these companies came along and saved it for a post-industrial kind of demise. And I don't see it like that at all. I don't see that as being the history of this place. It wasn't resurrected and revived by global capital. It's always been a place that has had some connection to outward and bigger stories around it. It's the place where the first railway line was built. It's where gas, coal, and timber were refined, transported and consumed in vast quantities. If you wanted a place on Earth, I think, to encapsulate the energy and momentum of the modern city, it would be this area I would first think of. And I don't put that down to foreign direct investment at all. And you see that as it grows as a city. So where we're standing here is green field, reclaimed space to the right of this map, which is from 1630. You can see it gradually being reclaimed and developed in the 18th century. So we're at the bottom right corner of this 18th century map by Rock. Very famous, and you've all seen it loads of times, I'm sure. We're here. It's kind of marshland. And that's all changed by the docks and the dockland, the Grand Canal docks in particular. So the interior of the country comes and meets the coast and the docks, and that happens right here. This is the meeting place of those things. So how does that affect this community? Well, the community only exists in this place because of that confluence of the interior and the exterior. It's a tightly knit community, and to me, historically, it's defined by work. This is a place where people work. There's been lots of heavy industry here. It's been highly dependent on local labour. And that labour is provided by pockets of residential communities that characterise the area right down to the present, as I came to know when I was community liaison officer. There's a sort of a micro-politics that who lives on which street, and, you know, don't get it wrong. So those residential communities form a sort of series of islands, I would say, and they're serving that large industry that exists all around it, right from the beginning. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about what's being made locally. You've seen all the beautiful things in Billy's presentation, so I can't compete with those absolutely gorgeous images. So I'm going to talk about more functional things that were made by people who worked in these industries. It's really interesting when you look at Great Brunswick Street, the old name for Pierce Street. Historically, if you check the city directories and see what was here, there's lots of different concentrations of things over time. It was a really busy shopping district at one point, especially up on the other end of Pierce Street. It doesn't feel like that today, and Trinity's partly responsible for that. decline of on-street shopping actually historically, so it's another great moment for us to be proud of. What stands out is that there are lots of Italian families, which is really interesting, and there's also lots of architects and lots of sculptors, and particularly people who specialised in industrial kind of monumental sculpture, so the creation of headstones and so on. And just like Billy showed us, ironwork is a huge part of what happened on Pearse Street historically as well. So not only Hammond Lane, but McLaughlin's and so on as well. Big, heavy, dirty industries to some degree. So in the 1850s, you find the Del Vecchio family at 200 Great Brunswick Street. They're specialists in plaster of Paris. And you can see that the family specialised in kind of fine art and prints from the late 18th century. And you can see that here just in a sort of 19th century advertisement that they have. So this is a Pearse Street family. They're on this street a long time, 2 or 3 generations, producing pretty ornate, high-level plaster. And you can see that the way they're sort of marketing for a high-end consumer here. It's also true of Nanetti's Emporium of Fine Arts, also on Great Brunswick Street, so Pearse Street, up towards the other end of it. And you also have big companies like Harrison and Sons. And the great thing about becoming obsessed with what was made on this exact site, as I have been for 2 or 3 years now, and its immediate surroundings, is you find examples of it all over the city. Right, so there are things that were made by people who worked in these places still exist. We see them all the time, and I'm just going to show you a couple of examples because they're spread all over the place. Very often on the south side, though they were made over here towards the docks. So sorry, just to explain these two. This is an early 20th century advertisement on the left. Although Harrison's were in business for about 120 years, and you can see they're monumental sculptors. So again, working on large monuments. And you can see that they're bragging about having done the restoration of Maynooth in the 1950s here, mid-20th century advertisement. All marble work done to the above. And if anybody knows how rich the Catholic Church was in the mid-20th century, you can be sure that was a lot of marble work. Kept the lads busy, I'm sure. So Harrison's did lots of high-end as well as the kind of industrial output, and one of the places where you'll find their work really visibly around Trinity is on the other side of Trinity, in this building on Kildare Street, formerly the Kildare Street Club, now Alliance Française, and the archives of the National Library. And one of my favourite things in Dublin is actually made by Harrison, which is this little ornate monkeys playing billiards at the base of those columns on the left. It's a magnificent little thing. Just happens that this one was done by Harrison's, but there's loads of examples. I can show you 40 images of things made by them. This is on O'Connell Street, the former Bank of Ireland, now disappointingly Smiles Dentists. You can see just beautiful ornate work done on the front of it. Another one would be the fruit market downtown and so on. There's loads. They did a huge amount of this kind of work. And they're not the only monumental sculptors on Pearse Street. Most famously, the family that Pearse Street is renamed for after Great Brunswick Street. So this is a shopfront image. There aren't that many of them actually, of Pearse and Sons. I'm not going to spend ages talking about them, partly because most people would probably know a great deal. But Willie and Patrick Pearse's dad was James Pearse, who was a really well-known sculptor and monumental worker in his day. You can see the sort of images just from the front, the kind of stuff that they were producing. So you can see Celtic crosses and so on. If you come to Glasnevin, you'll see tons of their work. You'll also see a lot of the church altars around town. Drumcondra and places like that are all done by Pearse and Sons. So it's easy to trace. Once you know what their style is, you'll see it everywhere and so on. Here's what Patrick Pearse had to say about his own dad as a sort of a craft worker. I came across this quote and I thought it's good as sort of appreciation. So he says, a strange artistic vein breaking out of him in spite of his mechanic occupation, a gift that might have been a torment and a glory to him, but for the sense of humour and contentment of spirit which kept him sane and sweet. So again, sort of a person who was, involved in an industrial sort of, but deeply committed to his craft, and you can see that transferred down to his son, Willie Pearse, some of whose work you can see in the Pearse Museum down in Rathfarnham. Willie obviously died too young to deliver on his potential, but you could see he was a really engaged sculptor just like his dad. So James Pearse's work is amazing, and you'll find it all over the place. These two images taken from the curator's work from the Pearse Museum, Brian Crowley, from a journal article he produced a few years ago, and you can just see the fine detail of the work Patrick Pearce's dad did. Okay, Hammond Lane. What about it? This is the site that we're in right now. We obnoxiously call it Trinity East, but we surely have to call it something. This is the site here. It's about 5.5 acres. That wasn't all Hammond Lane Foundry, but the majority of it was from about the early 1900s to about 1973 when it closed. I'm going to show you a map. I'm going to show you a series of maps now, just so you can see how it develops over time. Let's see if this thing works. We're sitting just here on the Mackin Street side. So in 1830s, there's nothing here on this site. You can see that the railway has just been built in this image for the Ordnance Survey, and there's just an empty lot above it in the centre, laid out for development alongside the dock. And you can see the dock's already been built about 40 years next to it, but it hasn't really developed much. Guinness has had a small warehouse on the site, but there's not a whole heap there. You can see that the residential community that we know very well, I think in this room, the bottom left, is starting to grow and populate, and so you see a lot of the workers who've been working in the area on the docks and so on, forming around it, but it's not very well developed. So the major expansion of this site, as we know it, really dates to the 1860s. There's a few things on site before that, between the 1840s and 1860s, but really Bewley, Moss and Co., so Bewley's invest in it, and they built that tower, which is behind us, and is a listed building in the 1860s. We don't know a whole heap about that tower. I'm going to show you as much as we do know in a minute, but you can see it on the maps here where it starts to develop. It's the first set of buildings that are on the site that we're on. So just above Sugar Works, that's the tower building, or the design tower as we call it today, where several people work in this audience, so you'll know it better than I will, and you can feel free to correct me if I get anything wrong. I'm all ears. Interesting to me because it's a sort of a nationalist sugar factory. Prior to this, a lot of sugar comes in from around the empire, a lot of it coming from the Caribbean, a lot of it derived from slave power plantations, but actually the sugar works that were here on site used Irish goods to create sugar. Unfortunately for it, that wasn't very profitable. It only lasted about 20-25 years and was replaced by a distillery. I'll show you that in a minute. This is a slightly more detailed image of the design tower / tower building. Why is it a listed building? Why will we knock it down? And why is it, an interesting one architecturally? The best way to look at that is to look at the person who built it. So it was largely designed by this guy, Alfred Derbyshire, and he left a set of memoirs which explain how he came to design it in the way he did. I'm not going to read all this out, you'd be happy to hear, but you can see he says that Bewley, Moss and Co. Determined to erect a large sugar refinery in the city. He was asked to provide plans for the building. He consulted with a really famous engineer of the era, William Fairbairn. And what was really interesting for Fairbairn was he wanted to build a multi-story sort of mini skyscraper, which is what that design tower is, and he wanted to do it with iron. So that was what was remarkable about it. They built it with cast iron, and that's how they could build it so tall and so thin. So that's why it's listed. No other reason. It's simply for its engineering element, not how it looks, which otherwise is kind of a functional building that's not particularly beautiful. Sorry about this. I hope I'm not offending anybody. So it's redeveloped in the 1970s. It was the first in what was to be a whole raft of city redevelopments designed around development or economic development. It was done in 1978. By 1983, as many of you will remember, there was a massive recession and all those city plans fell apart. So the only enterprise development centre that was actually built was this one here in Pearse Street. And it comes into Trinity's hands in the late 90s. So, we'll go back to the 19th century. The sugar works break up at some point in the 1880s, so they last about 20 years, and then the site is subdivided. And what happens is that there's a timber yard on one side, and then there's a distillery on the other side, which produced pot still whiskey. The timber yard stays going for a long time, actually. You can see that here. You can also see the size of the gasworks site, which is just opposite the foundry site at the top.
So this is the distillery, this is where we are, and this is the gasworks.
And the gasworks is a massive employer, as again I don't need to tell this crowd. And also I don't think enough has been written about the gasworks either, never mind the Hammond Lane, really in terms of history, for such an iconic and major industry in the heart of the city. So by 1916 it's clear from the OS maps that the eastern site is in the hands of Hammond Lane Foundry by the early 20th century. I'm not exactly sure when the Hammond was founded and transferred up here, and I'm not exactly sure either about the relationship between Hammond Lane, which is actually in Smithfield, as many of you will know, and this site, but I think there must have been a precursor site on Hammond Lane in Smithfield. I'm yet to find the evidence of it yet. So the foundry might have had a premises also in Church Street, but it certainly was at this site by 1908 and may have been here as early as 1902 in some form. You can see that here in this image. This is of Smithfield, and you can see the original Hammond Lane.
Still called Hammond Lane here. That's the Smithfield site of the cattle markets on the left, the big open space.
So that's where Hammond Lane comes from, as far as anyone knows. And this is the site as it moved down to right beside the Grand Canal Docks where it is today. So you can see it occupies most of the site.
To about here, that's the Dogs and Cats, so the DSPCA headquarters.
Okay, who owned Hammond Lane? The owner was David Frame, and there are generations of Frames that own it. The reason we know a good bit about David Frame, senior, he lives in Strand Road in Clontarf. There's a lovely house there. He puts in a 28-page claim in 1916 after the Helga bombs the factory site to bits. He doesn't get full compensation. You can download and read the whole 30-page, 28-page document, which goes into some detail. They give him about 2/3 of what he asks for, which is kind of the deal everybody got. And he probably asked for what he lost anyway, which was also an understood part of the process. But anyway, it didn't keep them out of business. They were back up and running in no time. Very interesting, this 1916 period around here. A lot of this area was levelled by the gunboats from the Liffey as they came in. So you can find an awful lot in these compensation records. If any of you are interested in looking it up, just give me a shout. I'll send you some material. So Hammond Lane, a large scrapyard there beside Ted Castle's coal yard. The next image is a photograph of that second site, closed down in the late 80s. It was a scrap metal place for the most part. Again, lots of people will remember that in a way that I don't. The next photograph's from the 1950s, and it shows you this site again. Thanks to Holly for this image, because I hadn't had it otherwise. It's from UCD Archives. And it shows Boland's Bakery building, which is now the Treasury building, or was the Treasury building. It's now owned by Google, is that right? It's depressing, isn't it?
Anyway, they own everything. This is the Hammond Lane Foundry site then. So it's sort of at its peak at this point in the 1950s. And the Frames remain owners of Hammond Lane until the 1970s. Closure happens in 1973, around the same time that the docklands, the dock starts to massively lay off people as well. So there's a huge moment of deindustrialisation. The containers come in, there's lots of people out of work, and the foundry going out of business was another kick for the area when they didn't need it. About 160 to 190 jobs are lost over the course of the redundancies. There's a reasonable amount of compensation, and nobody's happy about losing their job. Most people who worked here got work in the gasworks and so on. Some of them did, the younger people, the older ones didn't. And in fact, John talks about that in his interview. So what was made here? Back to the central thing that brings us all here on Design Week, and who made it? I'll just end with a few slides about that. So we can see in the early 20th century, most of what's been made here is a real broad range of metal products. The phrase I kept on coming across when I was researching it was that the sort of brag of the company was they'd make anything from a needle to an anchor, which sounds like unnecessary bragging. But they did make things as exotic as pig troughs, cheese presses, bandstands, and so on. One of the things John talks about in his interview is making the entire promenade of Bray. Every piece of ironwork there came out of Hammond Lane. I think partly because Davy Frame Junior at that stage was living in Bray, and that might have had something to do with it. But anyway, say that Ireland it's a lovely crooked little country. So here's some material that you can see. Again, I know some of you are some distance here, but you're able to get some sense of the variety of what was being made. One of the things they really specialised for a lot of the mid-20th century was range cookers. There was a few different types. The Zubri, I think, was one of them. Lasted about 25-30 years. And again, examples of these will be in country homes still to this day. Some of those ranges are probably still operational. And you can see that here on the advertisement on the right. Last time I was here, I showed a couple of these images. Really, for me, one of the standout Hammond Lane features of the Dublin landscape are these very ornate, very visible lampposts that you see all over the city. There's 2 or 3 different types. Up near me in Drumcondra, they're making ones they're now painted in green, but they're in a different style to this. The ones in town are really ornate. They often have shamrocks on them. You'll see them everywhere, Merrion Square, Mountjoy Square, and so on, all made here in this place. You'll also find these manhole covers everywhere. So this is from the 1930s, but really if a manhole cover was made between about 1920 and 1950, it was more than likely made here. And this is a toilet cistern, which they call the Hammond, which I like. Some of you might have one of them, I don't know. They also made sinks and bowls. Again, long-lasting, functional, much-needed things. Very often moving with whatever was in vogue at the time. There's this lovely image that you have a version of at the back, and you can go and look at in greater detail. Taken from a 1940s brochure. Breda found this in Jim Curtis's book on Ringsend. And what's interesting about it is it's a rare enough thing, it's a trade brochure, so they're sort of showing the process of how people made these range cookers, and they go through it step by step, which again just shows you what work was actually going on here, what people were actually doing. So I'm going to end shortly with just a couple of clips from John Berrigan's interview, and the reason I want to hear from him is he actually worked here, and it's like the spirits are coming to get us. So the reason I want his voice to end is because, well, like I say, he worked here. He can give us a sense of what's a completely unrecovered history. Otherwise, there's no history written of Hammond Lane. There's no history of the Frame family. It's a business that defined this area for, the guts of 100 years. And it's just interesting to hear what it would have been like to be here as quite a young apprentice. So I'll finish, if I can, a couple of images that John brought in the day he recorded his interview. You can just sort of have a look at them briefly because they help orient what he's going to say in these. I think it's just 2 minutes I'm going to play here. This is an image he did for his grandson to explain what work he did. John was born in 47. This was his first job as an apprentice here in 63. And this is him pouring metal into a mould. And then he also did an amazing thing, which is he mapped the entirety of the foundry site in the 1960s. And this doesn't exist really anywhere. Sorry, folks. It's actually kind of become part of the talk. Don't worry. So here we can see down to kind of a micro, where he's talking about who works where and so on. He goes through all that. So I'll just end by showing you that. So John is being interviewed by Ellen King. They're just chatting about what it's like to work in Hammond Lane, what happened here, how he sees his work.
So I read the figure. But I didn't realise when I entered the foundry in the morning, it's freezing cold.
Yeah.
Everything you handle is metal. It's freezing.
Yeah.
And then like that till you start working, you warm yourself up working.
Yeah.
You don't need to go training at night because it's physical work.
Yeah, very physical.
After 12 o'clock when the first bogey comes out, you're burnt, the heat in the places, you know, really, like, you can see that. And so it was all that, you know, but in the end, when you made something, when you made a mould, and you opened it up like this, you took out the pattern, and that was it. That to me was a work of art. I love doing it. I love making it. As I keep telling the lads at home, no matter what job you do, no matter whatever you do, there's always parts of it you're not going to like.
Of course, yeah.
You know, so it had its bits and pieces that I like. But I enjoyed working.
Yeah, no, but it's amazing to...
He said, he's just talking about the mould and what happens when you take it off. And he said to him, that's a work of art. I can absolutely see that it was, and that's exactly how you can see it. One more little clip.
And then whatever. But we used to do mostly industrial stuff. You know, like those big manholes out there. They put down to the ground inside. The guys, which I used to do, they had about that height. And every box, the mountain box has 4 handles on it. Either 4-handed lift or 2-handed lift. Some of them had hinges, but we didn't have hinges, we used to lift them. And we had a gantry as well, big jobs. But you'd start in the morning.
And what was, when did you start normally?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. And you go up and you have a little yak course with it. But then you go and you had to get your sand ready. And whatever jobs you were on. We usually had the same type of stuff. But it would work. Did you ever see them all now?
No.
Well, you get a pattern, say that. Just this right there. Now the pattern may only give you half of that. Right? So you put half it on a board, then you put a box up, then you put sifted sand on it, and you put sand on it, and you tack it, then you round it, and you turn that over. Then you had another half of that pattern that went on, and then you put another top on, and you did the same again, and you parted that, and you took out your pattern, then you had your mold. And then you had to make ingates, as we call them, for let the metal flow in. Then you had to pour the metal as per that.
And
so the reason I wanted to end with that was obviously none of those processes, because they weren't valued as high art or craft or anything at the time, none of those processes are recorded anywhere. What makes John's point of view really precious, even though to him it's just a chat about the work he used to do, is that that's the kind of thing that we just don't get. It just doesn't get archived, it doesn't get recorded anywhere. And when you're dealing with a place like this that is defined by people working for big business, it's a duty of all of us, I think, to try and record and also respect the work of people like John, whose work really defines this place and has much more to do with its history than anything that's come in here in the last 20, 30 years. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Thanks a million.
Thanks, Ciarán. Billy is going to join us. And if you have questions or comments, please feel free now. We might or might not use the mic, maybe not. But great, we have lots of people. And just to let you know, obviously, as you noticed before we started, we are recording this. So if you don't want to be in the video, maybe sit at the back or don't ask a question. But we are going to make this available on the Trinity YouTube site. So, yeah, do we try the mic, Dylan, or no?
Give me one moment, please.
Okay. Maybe you can just shout there for the moment going in.
Ciarán, just to say, the Frame family were involved in setting up Irish Steel.
Yeah, in the 30s, wasn't it?
But I don't know if you've come across, there is a history of Irish Steel, and it goes into it. My recollection is it goes into a bit of detail about the Frame family, so that might be
great. No, thanks. Yeah, I'm always on the lookout. And I saw there's another book just out by a fellow called Cullinan and the Cork University Press. It also looks at that sort of mid-20th century bit as well. So thanks very much. But I haven't actually looked at that history of Irish Steel. So thank you.
Okay. Hold on a second.
More honey? I'm joking. Just a comment, I have to excuse my speech, but Ireland being an island on the edge of Europe, so when we're looking at craft, we were very backward looking continually, up to recent times, visually, I'm talking about visually, in literature, poetry, not so, but visually we were always looking back, where Europe was looking outwards. Now I would say possibly our education, the religious has complete control, but when I came into this tower at one stage, there was a lecture being given by the IDA, and they said the Book of Kells is the only design you need. When Europe was working completely a different way, and that reflected everything Celtic. And we have started to move on, but still visual awareness in Ireland has a long way to go.
I wouldn't fully agree with you, to be honest. A lot of the sources for the art across here, there was books like the Book of Kells, but also ancient monuments and that. And they didn't spatially copy it, they used it as a source. And I'm thinking of someone like Harry Clark, say, who's an absolute singular genius. You know, and his reach was international. They were writing about him in the international studio. He was exhibiting, his work was all over the world. He was first known as a graphic artist. His books were published by Granatos in America, by Harps in the UK, and they were so widely circulated. I do agree that the church, say even in Clark's case, they were just prescriptive. He had to deliver this angle, so they didn't allow the church, and who were a major patron, didn't allow much freedom. But I think there was a fair bit, like even the poster there for Frank Graham, and that's just one. I think they were looking abroad as well. And I take your point, but for the church were such a major patron, and most of the control was very restrictive in what it could be. But I think some of the artists, despite that, reached outside and did look abroad and looked to modernism. I see even Michael Healy's work there for Tour Clinton as well. I see lots of Japanese influences. So I think it's arguable. I think there's valid points on both sides, and I do agree. And I would read that quite often, what you're saying, point of view.
So thank you both for your lecture. Just a comment on Lily and Lolly Yates and how important they were in the arts and craft movement. Their graves were in very bad state of neglect.
It's been completely renovated.
Have they?
Yeah, it's been completely done. There is Sky Arts in a documentary on the Yates sisters, which I actually saw a preview of just the other day. They've been renovated as part of that, so you actually see the renovation during the documentary. I think it's out before Christmas.
Awesome.
Just thinking about the Hammond Lane site, and kind of in latter years everybody's talking about the building environment and holding on to the pieces of our building environment, and we haven't come better at it, But we tend to look at the building as just the building. And last week they told us on the old school in Rutland Street, and we were standing in the back of the building in home, because the building's going to regenerate, and you just happen to look up. And here on the outside, there's this massive pipe, and the down pipes, the drain pipes, on the top of this building, well, it works of art. Never, living there all my life, never seen it, at the back of a red brick building. And it should be seen as part of the built environment, because it is art, the same as those buildings are.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. It is, and it's undervalued. And I don't know why that is. It's a sort of a class condescension or something. It wasn't made by, with the greatest respects to the Yates and all the rest, and I do think their work is undervalued. But works that are made by bourgeois South Dubliners are respected.
Yeah. But that's the point. That was my whole point in sort of wanting to get this, because I worked in the jewellery trade, and I just, I actually saw the two sides. And there was huge richness and people, and it was just fantastic, a whole culture. And it's sort of like, there's, and I have come across attitudes all my life, and you come across these, and I just think there's a hidden richness that's not valued, and also there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot, that should be, because, when you say that, you can't value you can't think of the future. You have to value these things in the present in order to, you know, and I mean, so much was produced here. I mean, all those lamps and all, you know, somebody designed those. And I thought that the street lamp was very interesting, because those lamps were probably done in the early 20th century or the 19th, and they're containing one of the emblems of Ireland. And I think that's extremely interesting for the time, and that it actually reached common street furniture, that they were putting the emblems in it. And somebody decided that, somebody thought that would be acceptable, and somebody made a nice job of the design. And that was done here. You know what I mean? And they're the stories because that, you know, it shouldn't be separated. I mean, you know, also there's things that the artists would have done to the crowd up that were on Pier Street. The links are there, and and I mean, I'm sure they were very, very important in getting and making some of those works of art to actually function properly as what they were meant to be, because the apertures, whatever it is they created, actually formed part of them. But you know, it's just when you said that before about the lamps, it really intrigued me, because that's everyday life for people, you know, and people were looking up and walking down the streets and seeing this emblem. And that's, you know, you didn't get shamrocks in London, you got them in Dublin. Do you know what I mean? And it's been sort of ignored, those kind of gestures. And they're beautiful, like, they're not ugly, you know. And a lot of that stuff is, I mean, the gates outside Westminster House are fabulous.
Amazing, yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's just really odd that it does focus on certain people from, you know, and like, while richness is brought from all sorts of sources, it's funny how some are chosen above others sometimes, the values that are placed. That's all, you know. So it'd be lovely if anyone worked in any, like Hammond Lane, can talk about their experiences here in the audience, or, you know, or their family members before them, too.
I was at a talk recently by the city architect of Malmö in Sweden, and he was saying one of the ways that they were trying to get people engaged in the architecture of the city, one of the things that they did was a brick safari, and I was intrigued to know what a brick safari was. But seemingly in Sweden there were hundreds of different brick manufacturers, and a stone block layer would bring people out to identify the different bricks and the different regions they were from. But I think it would be a very good idea to do that sort of thing, bring people around, and like you were saying, show them the sort of details that everybody passes by and doesn't look down and see the names of it, you know, and the ironwork around Trinity College and that, you know, who that was made by. I'm sure Reg would know. But
Karen would know.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can do a whole alternative history of the city by just going around and pointing these things out.
Yeah.
As you say.
It's the things that people forget about or don't see in their everyday life.
Specifically on bricks in the architectural archive this week. There was a book launch on brick makers in Ireland over the last couple of years. I'm not sure who wrote it.
The ones near me are all from Dolphin's Barn. When you do any renovation at Dracondra House, they have Dolphin's Barn written across them. You gave me a brick with
One of the city historians has written about Dolphin Barn bricks. I think it's Cathy Scuffin.
Cathy Scuffin, she's great. Yeah, she's brilliant. Yeah, and this kind of work is happening, but it's not the mainstream, and that's the it's funny you should mention Malmö in Swedish, because myself and Billy had a chat about this not that long ago. Because Ireland also talks about itself as having a lesser design or aesthetic culture than lots of other countries, some of that stuff that was made in the mid-20th century is undervalued because of that, right? Because we think, we've never really done that, you know, and it was good way back and it's good now, and there's the sort of middle, I'm speaking sort of chronologically, we kind of undervalue it. And I don't know why that is. It's partly because, I mean, Billy's more qualified to speak about this than me, but those Nordic or Scandinavian principles of everyday design, they weren't really government backed on a kind of on a mass scale as they were in other European countries, and they don't have a museum of art and design.
No, it's all like a design museum.
Yeah,
huge.
I think that's a big. Yeah, and we should have one.
Yeah.
No? Yeah, sorry, Billy. I don't know if you want.
Yeah, no. I just echo.
I suppose Consparics likely to function something, but yeah, no, we should have.
Yeah.
The curator in
in most other cities, there's a specific design museum.
Yeah.
It would be a bit different than Consparics.
There was a lovely curator. A lot of you know he's up in the port now. Larry Joy once told me that in the there was a period where the National Museum only had enough money to buy one chair of any particular style that was made, right, of any design at the moment. So they have a warehouse full of chairs and nothing else. So he said he could do a whole museum of chairs in Ireland.
Could I make a suggestion?
Sorry.
The Dublin City Council just bought Aldeburgh House on the north side, a beautiful big house. Fantastic. It's really, really super.
And it's an amazing house.
Oh,
I used to live in European colleges.
Well, it was in Dublin 2 or Dublin 4, I'd say it wouldn't be sitting in the great thing.
Yeah, that's true.
And really, they'd be looking for something to do with it.
There's been such pressure for so long for something to happen.
Ciarán, can I just ask you, Hammond Lane's kind of neighbours across the water would have been Boland's flour mill, and Patrick Boland was the founder of that company, starting in Capel Street. And I think actually they were still operating in Capel Street when he started up here. Acquired the site from the Pym family, huge expansion, and then built the bakery. And I just went online trying to find out more about this guy, Patrick Boland. There's practically nothing written about Boland's. He doesn't even have an entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography. And he would have been a substantial. Well, nowadays he would be regarded as an industrialist. I suppose then he might have been just dismissed as another baker. But that business survived right up until the 90s, acquired by IAWS, and subsequently went into receivership. And now we see what's happened. But have you any information at all about
Patrick Boland specifically? It's funny, I know there's a big excavation of that bakery site in Capel Street happening.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of artefacts actually from the original bakery still
and
there.
apparently they're going to keep the shell, which will have some bakery elements in it, in whatever's been developed.
Yeah, it's amazing it survived.
Yeah, but that's great. And again,
but anyway, you haven't come across any of that?
No, I haven't worked on Boland myself.
Okay.
Actually, it's not in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, it's newspaper archives, probably the best place for information.
Yeah, a project for somebody.
Could be a project for you.
That's exactly what I was saying.
Just take one more question, then we can continue the conversation over refreshments before Breda.
The symbol on a lot of poles around Dublin, the three castles, the Dublin symbol. Who is that designed by, and the phrase underneath?
Well, Donald Fallon has an amazing podcast called Three Castles Burning, and he's written about it loads of times on the community blog, and I think he's done a podcast on it too. So I won't claim over Donald Fallon, but it's one of the actually enduring mysteries of Dublin as to why there's three castles burning as it's made. That's an amazing sentence, isn't it? Yeah. If Donald Fallon doesn't know, and I don't know, I'm afraid if you solve that mystery, it'd be great.
Great.
What's your project?
Breda's going to finish us
We'll
off.
just conclude, and thanks everybody for your comments, remarks and everything you said. I just want to thank a couple of people now. The Design and Crafts Council of Ireland for hosting Design Week this week and sponsoring this event. Trinity College for hosting us here in Unit 18, and Mary for all the help and support, and to both of our speakers, Billy and Ciarán, thank you very much, and all of you who shared your stories. So thanks, and we're off to have our...
For a glass of vino or some sparkling water.